The torchlight writhes against the wet stone, each flicker casting twisted shadows that resemble bodies writhing in their last moments. The iron gate slams shut with a clang that echoes like a death sentence, sealing the dungeon in suffocating silence. Imagine being dragged here, wrists bound so tight your hands throb, eyes straining in the dark, and then seeing them, the cages. Not cages for men, not cages for beasts of war, but cages filled with rats. Their red eyes glint in the firelight, their squeals sharp as blades, their teeth gnashing against the bars as if they already taste your flesh. You realize too late that these are not prisoners. They are executioners. The soldiers press the cage against your bare torso, lock it into place, and bring a torch close. The metal heats the rats' panic, and there is only one escape for them through you. What follows is not death, but something far worse. The feeling of claws tearing into your skin, of teeth ripping their way inside of your own screams, drowning beneath the frenzy of vermin unleashed. Tonight, we descend into one of the most sadistic nightmares of the Dutch Revolt. A war not only of blood and empire, but of horrors crafted to break the human spirit. And before we unmask the full terror of rat torture, make sure you hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear will crawl under your skin and gnaw at you long after the screen goes black. The Dutch Revolt, also called the 80 Years' War, began in 1568. For nearly a century, the lowland provinces struggled against the crushing grip of the Spanish Empire. The Catholic crown sought obedience, the Protestants sought freedom, and between them lay villages, burned families scattered, and justice twisted into terror. The Spanish governors understood that war was not only fought with steel, it was fought with fear. And to win, they were willing to break not just bones, but souls. At the heart of this reign of terror was the Duke of Alba, known as the Iron Duke. He established the Council of Blood, a tribunal that condemned thousands to death. But executions alone were not enough. To break the will of the Dutch rebels, more inventive cruelties were devised, punishments so grotesque they would linger in the imagination long after the scream stopped. Among them was the infamous rat torture, a method as crude as it was horrifying. Picture the scene: a prisoner stripped to the waist, forced to lie flat upon the cold floor of a cellar. Soldiers bring forth a small iron cage, inside it a writhing, squealing rat. The cage is strapped tightly onto the victim's bare stomach or chest. At first, the rat claws helplessly against the bars, seeking escape. Then the back of the cage is heated with burning coals. Trapped, desperate, and frantic, the creature does the only thing it can. It digs forward, gnawing into the soft flesh of the prisoner beneath. The agony was unimaginable. Victims screamed as tiny teeth tore through skin, as claws scraped against muscle, as panic and pain merged into one unbearable crescendo. To the torturers, this was not merely execution. It was psychological warfare. Witnesses spread tales of the horror throughout the province's, stories that magnified the cruelty of Spain's rule. To resist was to risk not only death, but a death so monstrous that even in rumor it chilled the blood. Accounts from rebel chronicles describe these moments in chilling detail. One survivor recalled the stench of singed iron, the hiss of hot coals, and the sound of frantic squeals mixed with muffled human cries. He wrote, "We prayed for the rat to find mercy, though it was only an animal, and for the torment to end swiftly. But nothing in that chamber was swift, only slow, gnawing death." His testimony survived not only as memory, but as warning. The method was brutally effective in its design. Unlike quick execution, rat torture prolonged suffering for hours, sometimes days, depending on how deeply the creature burrowed before the victim succumbed. Some prisoners begged their captors to kill them outright, offering confessions, secrets, anything if only the cage would be removed. But mercy was rare. The goal was not confession alone, it was spectacle. Terror, once whispered, spread faster than any rebel message. This cruelty did not exist in isolation. The Spanish crown had long used terror as policy, burning villages, executing rebels, displaying heads on spikes. But rat torture was different. It was intimate, grotesque, and humiliating. It reduced proud men to whimpering prey women, to writhing bodies begging for an end. It was not only the destruction of life, but the destruction of dignity, and that perhaps was its greatest weapon. Villagers who heard of these punishments lived in constant dread. Parents warned children to stay silent, to obey, to never cross the soldiers. Some swore they heard the scratching of rats in the night and woke in terror, convinced they would be next. In taverns, whispers grew of cellars beneath garrisons of cages, stacked like tools waiting for the next rebel to fall into Spanish hands. The fear alone served as a chain binding communities into submission. Yet fear breeds resistance as surely as obedience. The Dutch rebels learned to use Spain's cruelty against them, spreading tales of rat torture far and wide. Pamphlets illustrated the cages, sermons thundered against the inhumanity, and rebels swore vengeance for every gnawed corpse. The very tool designed to terrify would in time ignite outrage strong enough to fuel rebellion. But for now, in those early years, the rats fed, the prisoners screamed, and the darkness of the dungeon grew thicker with every life consumed. The Duke of Alba believed terror was more efficient than endless battles. A sword could kill one man, but fear could conquer 1,000. Each execution, each display of cruelty was meant to echo beyond the dungeon walls. Rat torture became a whispered legend, its horror exaggerated by imagination, which made it even more powerful. To the Spanish, it was a weapon of psychological warfare. To the Dutch, it was the face of tyranny itself. Rebel chronicles tell us of a young man named Peter captured during a raid near Haarlem. Dragged into a garrison cellar, he was tied down and forced to endure the cage. His screams echoed through the stone corridors, and though his comrades tried to storm the fortress, they arrived too late. All that remained was his body torn open, gnawed from within, a grotesque testament to cruelty. His story spread like wildfire, his name whispered as both martyr and warning. The cruelty extended beyond soldiers. Ordinary townsfolk suspected of aiding the rebellion could be dragged from their homes. Some were accused falsely, victims of neighbors' grudges or Spanish paranoia. Imagine a mother stripped before soldiers, her children forced to watch as the cage was fastened to her belly. In these moments, the punishment destroyed not just the victim, but the family, the community, the fragile bonds of trust that held villages together. The sensory nightmare of rat torture made it unforgettable. Survivors, rare as they were, spoke of the sound, the frantic scratching as claws tore into skin, the muffled squeals as the creature forced its way deeper. They remembered the heat of the iron cage burning their flesh from above, while pain erupted from within. It was a horror designed to consume every sense, leaving no escape, no reprieve, no dignity. As reports of these cruelties spread, resistance hardened. Dutch preachers used the stories in sermons, painting Spain as an empire of demons. Pamphlets depicted rats bursting from prisoners' stomachs, grotesque engravings passed hand to hand in flaming rage. What Spain saw as a tool of fear, the Dutch turned into a rallying cry. Better to die a rebel, they said, than to live under the rat's teeth. Among the soldiers themselves, some began to recoil. Letters smuggled from Spanish ranks revealed discomfort, even disgust. One soldier wrote, "I fear not the rebels' swords, but the cries of men whose entrails fed vermin. I hear them still at night scratching beneath the floorboards." Even among the perpetrators, the method sowed unease, proof that cruelty corrodes not only victims but those who wield it. Still others embraced the horror with zeal. Torturers saw themselves as artisans of pain, perfecting their craft. Some experimented with different cage sizes, different heating methods, prolonging the agony as long as possible. For them, it was not war, but theater, each scream another verse in their play of dominance. These were the true monsters, ordinary men who found purpose in the suffering of others. The rat torture became infamous enough that even foreign observers took note. English spies reported the atrocities back to Queen Elizabeth's court, strengthening support for the Dutch cause. France too watched with horror. Spain's cruelty, intended to instill fear, instead isolated them, turning potential allies into critics. The method that was meant to crush rebellion instead fed international outrage. By the 1580s, stories of rat torture were inseparable from the identity of the revolt. To be Dutch was to know the risk of the cage, to live under its shadow. Even in towns untouched by Spanish occupation, nightmares of scratching claws haunted sleep. Fear united people as much as it divided them, weaving their suffering into a shared memory that demanded resistance. And yet, the most chilling detail was this: the torture did not always kill quickly. Some victims lingered, left to bleed and rot after the rats had done their work. Their moans filled the nights of garrisons, their bodies displayed in town squares as warnings. Death was not the end, but part of the message. The Spanish crown was saying to the Dutch people, "Your rebellion will not only fail, it will be devoured from the inside out." As the rebellion dragged on, the Spanish relied ever more heavily on fear. Entire towns were threatened with the rat cage if they refused to pay taxes or hand over rebels. In some cases, prisoners were paraded through the streets, the cages strapped on but not yet lit, forcing neighbors to watch as the condemned begged for mercy. The ritual humiliation was almost worse than the torture itself, for it left everyone with the dread certainty of what could come next. One chilling account tells of a merchant in Utrecht accused of supplying the rebels with grain. He was bound in the public square, the cage tied to his chest, a rat snarling inside. The soldiers pressed a torch to the bars until the animal screeched in panic. Witnesses swore that the man prayed not for rescue, but for death, his voice breaking into sobs as the rat clawed against his ribs. He did not survive the night. His shop was looted, his family scattered, and his story became another warning etched into memory. The Dutch rebels, however, turned these horrors into fuel. Ballads were sung in taverns, turning martyrs into heroes. Children whispered about the rat cage like a monster under the bed, but in their whispers was defiance. One day, the rats will turn on their masters. Fear did not extinguish hope. It twisted it into rage, and rage forged unity. The very cruelty designed to break the Dutch spirit instead welded it into iron. Meanwhile, hidden voices inside Spain questioned the cruelty. Priests wrote cautious letters to superiors arguing that such tortures endangered souls as much as bodies. Some warned that the wrath of God would fall upon those who used animals as weapons against his children. But their warnings were drowned out by politics and war. The empire valued obedience more than conscience, silence more than mercy. Survivors, few as they were, bore scars that spoke louder than words. A man who endured the cage but lived carried claw marks across his abdomen for the rest of his life. When he walked through markets, people turned away in horror, unable to face the physical evidence of what Spain had done. He became a living ghost, his body a walking testament to cruelty, his presence a reminder of the price of rebellion. Not every story ended in death or survival. Some prisoners were broken so completely by the torture that they betrayed comrades, revealing hiding places, codes, and plans. These confessions cost the rebels dearly. Villages burned, leaders were hanged, secret networks exposed, all because one man could not endure the rat gnawing into his flesh. In this way, the cage became not only a weapon of death, but a weapon of betrayal. The legend of the rat torture reached beyond the Netherlands. Sailors carried the tales to ports in England, France, and the German states. In each retelling, the horror grew. Some swore the rats could burrow straight through a body emerging from the back. Others claimed victims screamed for days before dying. Whether true or embellished, the stories ensured that Spain's name became synonymous with inhuman cruelty across Europe. By now, the Spanish crown had earned a reputation for cruelty that even its victories could not erase. The Council of Blood. The burnings, the cages, all painted Spain not as a ruler, but as a tyrant. Foreign courts used the stories as propaganda, casting Spain as the empire of monsters. The Duke of Alba, once feared, became a symbol of heartless oppression. The rat torture, though rare in practice, loomed larger than battles in shaping Europe's perception. Within the Netherlands, whispers of justice grew louder. Priests urged rebellion as a moral duty, citing the tortures as proof that Spain's rule was ungodly. Mothers told children bedtime prayers not just for protection, but for deliverance from the cage of teeth. Even those who had once wavered in loyalty began to harden. Cruelty had created not compliance but determination. Every scream in a dungeon became a spark in the fire of revolt. And so the rat torture, though designed to crush hope, began to backfire. Each story, each scar, each mutilated body pushed the Dutch closer to unity. The cage intended to silence became a drumbeat of resistance echoing across towns and villages. Spain had hoped to rule with terror, but terror had limits. The rats gnawed at flesh, but they also gnawed at Spain's own reputation, leaving wounds that no victory could heal. By the early 1570s, the Dutch rebels had learned to turn Spanish cruelty into a weapon of their own. They printed leaflets describing the rat torture in lurid detail, spreading them across Europe. The engravings showed cages pressed against the bellies of bound men, flames licking the bars, and rats lunging forward. The more grotesque the images, the more they rallied sympathy for the Dutch cause. Spain's terror became the rebels' propaganda. In Haarlem, as the city braced for siege, citizens whispered of what awaited them if the walls fell. They spoke not of ordinary death, but of the rats. Mothers held their children close, praying aloud that God would spare them from such a fate. Fear filled the air like smoke, but beneath it smoldered defiance. Better to die on the walls, one defender said, than to die screaming beneath a rat's teeth. When Haarlem eventually fell in 1573, the Spanish unleashed brutal reprisals. Executions filled the streets. Prisoners marched in chains, and rumors swirled of dungeons beneath the city, echoing with animal shrieks. Whether or not the cages were used here, the mere possibility magnified the horror. The people believed the rats waited in the dark, and belief was enough to spread terror faster than any weapon. Rebel leaders understood the power of story. William of Orange, figurehead of the resistance, did not need to invent Spanish cruelty. He only needed to let it speak for itself. His letters spoke of God's judgment on tyrants of martyrs, whose deaths would not be forgotten. Each time he invoked the image of torture, his words struck deeper, because everyone already knew someone who had vanished into a dungeon and never returned. Meanwhile, Spanish garrisons fortified their strongholds, convinced that fear kept the Dutch in line. But cracks began to show. Soldiers deserted, some carrying with them the memory of screams they could not forget. One deserter confessed to Dutch commanders, "I can fight in battle, but I cannot fight against the sound of a rat devouring a man alive." His testimony spread like wildfire, another nail in the coffin of Spanish authority. The method was not always confined to rebels. Some prisoners of war from France and England, caught aiding the Dutch, found themselves subjected to the same fate. These international victims ensured that the story leapt borders. In London, tavern sailors described it with pale faces. In Paris, poets turned it into allegory. Spain could no longer contain its reputation. It had birthed a legend too gruesome to control. For the Dutch common folk, the torture became more than rumor, it became a symbol. Rats, once ordinary pests, were now feared as omens. Children cried at their sight. Farmers set extra traps, and households swore that scratching in the walls at night meant death was coming. The animal itself had been transformed into a messenger of terror, one the Spanish could wield without even lifting a whip. Yet the more Spain leaned on cruelty, the more they underestimated the human will to resist. In towns where the cages had been used, survivors carried rage like fire in their veins. One man who had seen his brother perish under the rat cage joined the rebels with nothing but a pitchfork, swearing never to rest until the Spanish were driven out. His personal vendetta became part of the wider rebellion, proof that cruelty often creates the resistance it seeks to crush. As the war entered its second decade, pamphlets abroad referred to the Dutch revolt as a war of faith and rats. Spain had wanted to inspire dread, but instead it inspired disgust. The Inquisition. The burnings, the cages, all melded together into one monstrous image of tyranny. Europe began to see the Dutch not as mere rebels, but as victims of unimaginable oppression worthy of aid and sympathy. By the time the Duke of Alba was recalled to Spain in 1573, his legacy was already stained with blood and horror. He had believed terror could forge obedience, but instead it left scars that turned obedience into hatred. His name was cursed in Dutch households, and the rat torture was whispered as his ultimate symbol of cruelty. Though Alba left the Netherlands, the rats remained in memory in nightmares and in the determination of a people who would not forget. Even as Alba departed, the machinery of cruelty did not vanish. His successors, desperate to maintain Spain's grip, continued the practice of spectacle. In Leiden, citizens preparing for siege whispered that captured rebels were subjected to cages in the garrison's cellars. Whether fact or rumor mattered little, the fear itself gnawed through morale like the rats through flesh. For the besieged, the sound of scratching claws in the night was enough to steal sleep. The psychological warfare was devastating. Some prisoners, when threatened with the rat cage, confessed without a single flame lit beneath the bars. They revealed hideouts, codes, even the names of neighbors, driven by imagination alone. Torture did not always need execution. Sometimes the promise of it was enough. Spain discovered that rumor could be as sharp a weapon as the steel blade, and rumor needed no effort to spread. Yet such cruelty carried consequences. Entire villages rose in revolt, swearing vengeance for what had been done in their cellars. Women who lost husbands to the cages sent their sons to the rebel armies. Priests thundered from pulpits that Spain had allied itself with the devil, for only demons would turn God's creatures into tools of torment. The rebellion grew not despite the cruelty, but because of it, each act of terror fueling the fire of resistance. Survivors described the lingering trauma as worse than the scars. One man swore he could still feel the claws beneath his skin years after escaping. Another avoided cellars entirely, trembling at the sight of cages, or even the sound of squealing pigs. These men carried the war inside their bodies long after the battlefield had moved elsewhere, silent reminders of the empire's brutality. Foreign powers seized the stories eagerly. In England, pamphlets described the Spanish rat torture in graphic detail, stirring outrage among Protestants. Queen Elizabeth's advisors used the tales to justify sending aid to the Dutch, framing Spain not only as a political threat, but as an inhuman monster. Thus, the cage became more than local horror. It became international propaganda, painting Spain's empire as rotten at its core. Meanwhile, Spanish commanders doubled down. Convinced that fear worked, they encouraged jailers to keep the cages ready. Some reports even claimed that children were threatened in front of their parents, the rats shrieking in their little prisons as soldiers waved torches nearby. Whether or not the cages were lit, the image alone was enough to break hearts and force compliance. The cruelty had become a ritual repeated until it lost even the pretense of necessity. But cruelty cannot sustain an empire forever. In the late 1570s, Dutch resistance grew bolder. Towns once cowed by fear began to defy garrisons openly. When rebels recaptured strongholds, they exposed the dungeons to daylight. Inside, villagers found scorched cages, gnawed bones, and walls blackened by smoke. These discoveries confirmed the rumors and hardened hatred. Spain's terror had become self-evidence carved into stone and iron. One chilling account tells of a dungeon near Breda where rebels uncovered a pile of cages stacked like firewood. Each bore scorch marks, and inside some the skeletal remains of rats still clung to rusted bars. On the floor lay scraps of clothing, buttons, and bone fragments. The rebels carried them into daylight for all to see, parading the evidence before townsfolk. The sight silenced any doubt. No rumor could exaggerate what the people now saw with their own eyes. The discovery became a rallying cry. Rebel leaders spread the tale across Europe. Here is Spain's justice cages of vermin bellies, ripped souls consumed. Priests declared the cages proof of Satan's rule in the Low Countries. Mothers lifted their children high in church, vowing they would never live under such tyranny. Each piece of rusted iron became more than evidence. It became a relic of resistance, a holy reminder of what they fought to destroy. By now, the Spanish no longer inspired obedience. They inspired rage. For every village silenced by fear, another rose with vengeance. For every rebel broken under claws and teeth, 10 more swore oaths beneath church arches to fight until freedom came. Spain had unleashed the rats upon their enemies, but in the end, it was Spain's own power that was gnawed away bite by bite until its grip began to falter. As the revolt entered its later decades, Spain's iron grip weakened not from lack of soldiers or cannons, but from the corrosion of its own cruelty. Rat torture had achieved a reputation that could not be erased. In markets and taverns, people spoke of it with the same hushed tone as they spoke of plague or famine. It had become a symbol of evil so complete that no Spanish victory could ever wash it away. The rebels knew this and wielded the image of the rat cage like a sword. Pamphleteers illustrated exaggerated scenes: rats bursting through victims' chests, soldiers laughing as flames licked the bars. Though not every drawing reflected truth, everyone carried weight. The point was not accuracy, but impact, and the impact was devastating. Europe recoiled, and Spain's image as a devout Catholic empire curdled into that of a sadistic tyrant. By the 1580s, the war had ground into stalemate, but the Spanish crown could not shake the specter of its own reputation. Even neutral states hesitated to side with them, wary of being stained by association. The rat torture, once a secret method hidden in dungeons, had become international knowledge. The horror escaped the shadows and entered the courts of kings and queens, where it whispered in the ears of rulers and poisoned Spain's diplomacy. For ordinary Dutch people, the rat torture lived on in nightmares. Farmers heard scratching in their barns and shivered. Children recoiled at the sight of rodents, their innocence colored by stories told around the hearth. Women who had lost sons or husbands to the dungeons kept cages in their attics, not as tools, but as warnings teaching the next generation what had been done to them. Trauma became inheritance, passed silently through families. Survivors carried visible reminders of their ordeal. Some bore scars across their stomachs and chests, the flesh forever marked by claws and teeth. Others could not eat without retching, remembering the sensation of movement within their bodies. These men and women became living monuments to Spain's cruelty, their mere presence in villages igniting anger that outlived the battles themselves. The cruelty even seeped into religion. Preachers thundered that the rats were instruments of hell unleashed by the Spanish crown. They painted sermons with vivid imagery, Satan himself commanding vermin to devour the faithful. Congregations gasped, cried, and swore to fight. Fear was transformed into fury, and fury became faith. Spain, by trying to terrify, had created a religious war it could not control. Over time, the cruelty began to eat away at Spain's own soldiers. Some became numb, drinking heavily to silence the screams. Others deserted outright, unwilling to carry cages into villages where children wailed at their approach. In whispered letters, soldiers confessed that the true enemy was not the Dutch rebels, but the nightmares they carried in their own heads. Cruelty had not only fractured the Dutch, but hollowed the Spanish as well. When Spain's forces faltered, the rebels struck harder. They recaptured strongholds, tore down gallows, and paraded broken cages through the streets as proof of their suffering. One chronicler described how villagers smashed the iron bars with hammers, scattering the pieces like cursed relics. In doing so, they symbolically destroyed Spain's hold over them. The rats were gone, but their memory lingered in every fragment of scorched metal. The psychological power of the torture endured, even when its practice waned. By the 1590s, the Spanish crown avoided direct reference to it, but the damage was done. The very word rat became a slur against Spanish authority. Rebels painted rats on walls, carved them into doors, and used the image as a banner of defiance. What was once meant to inspire fear had become an emblem of resistance. And so the legacy of the rat torture was paradoxical. Spain had unleashed it to silence rebellion, but in the end, it gave the Dutch a story so horrifying it bound them together. Pain had become power. The cage that devoured bodies now fueled unity, and unity would prove stronger than any empire's cruelty. By the early 1600s, Spain's once fearsome grip over the Netherlands had loosened. Victories on the battlefield could not erase the stains left in dungeons. The memory of the rat cages became a moral weapon sharper than any sword. Even when peace treaties were discussed, Dutch negotiators invoked the cruelty, demanding recognition of their suffering and the end of Spanish dominance. The empire's power was weakening, gnawed not just by rebels, but by its own legacy. In villages across the provinces, stories of rat torture passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Around fireplaces, elders whispered of the cages of the scratching claws and the screams that followed. The children who grew up with these stories carried a hatred of Spain deeper than politics. It was personal, rooted in blood and bone. Generations later, when the Dutch Republic stood independent, they still remembered themselves as the people who had survived the rats. Foreign writers seized the tale and wove it into Europe's imagination. In London, pamphlets compared Spain to ancient Rome's cruelest emperors. In Paris, poets described the cages as instruments forged in hell's furnace. The story spread so far that even those who knew little of the war knew of the rats. Spain's cruelty became legend, and legends are harder to erase than history. Some historians later questioned how often the torture was actually used. Perhaps it was rarer than pamphlets suggested. Perhaps propaganda exaggerated the scale. But in war, perception is reality. The Dutch believed it, the Spanish feared its reputation, and Europe remembered it. Whether used a dozen times or 100, the horror it symbolized became eternal, embedded in the story of the revolt. Survivors and witnesses carried scars far beyond the battlefield. One soldier, long after the war, confessed that he still woke at night to the sound of scratching claws. Another survivor, a woman who had lost her husband to the cage, never entered a cellar again, saying, "Darkness itself smells of iron." These testimonies remind us that torture lingers in the mind long after it ends in flesh. The Spanish Empire eventually declined its vast power, fractured its reputation forever, shadowed by cruelty. The Dutch Republic, born of blood and defiance, flourished into one of Europe's most prosperous states. And at the root of its unity lay shared suffering, the memory of cages that had once torn them apart but ultimately bound them together. History had turned horror into foundation, but the story did not remain confined to the past. Later centuries invoked the rat torture whenever cruelty needed a symbol. In prisons, in wars, in whispered threats, the image re-emerged. It became shorthand for the darkest depths of human invention, proof that mankind could twist even nature into a weapon. The rats of the Dutch revolt never truly died. They became archetypes of fear. Even today, the tale unsettles. Museums display illustrations of the cages, and visitors recoil instinctively. Historians debate its frequency, but ordinary people feel its truth in their bones. The thought of a creature forced to burrow through human flesh bypasses logic and strikes at something primal. It terrifies because it feels both impossible and entirely believable. The legacy of the rat torture forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How far will power go to maintain itself? How easily can cruelty be disguised as discipline or justice? And how often do we as bystanders allow fear to silence us until it is too late? The story is not only about Spain and the Dutch, it is about the darkness that can grow anywhere if left unchecked. And so we close this descent into history's shadows. The rat torture of the Dutch revolt was meant to crush rebellion, but instead it became a symbol of tyranny, a rallying cry for freedom, and a reminder that cruelty corrodes its wielder as much as its victim. As you step away from this story, ask yourself, what horrors are we blind to today, hidden in plain sight? If you want to keep unveiling the darkest truths of history with me, Make sure you like, share, and subscribe because the next chapter may be even darker.